Before 221B Baker Street, before Moriarty, Irene Adler, or even Dr. Watson, there was a secret, a tragedy buried deep in Sherlock Holmes's past. What if the world's greatest detective wasn't born from brilliance alone, but from a personal wound he never dared reveal? In this untold tale, we uncover the mystery that made Holmes not just a master of deduction, but a man haunted by loss, driven by loyalty, and changed by grief. Stay with us as we open the pages of a story even Watson never intended to publish, until now. It was in the autumn of 1887, a season of murky skies and ill humors, that I observed in my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes a certain restlessness of spirit that I had seldom seen equaled. The fire in our sitting room at Baker Street had been stoked to a cheerful roar, and yet he stood at the window with arms folded, gazing into the gray veil of fog that clung to the lamplighters like the shrouds of the grave. We had been without a case for a fortnight, and though many men might welcome a respite, Holmes, that singular creature whose faculties demanded constant exercise, showed every sign of mental starvation. He had not reached for the cocaine, though the bottle stood in its familiar place upon the mantel, but his fingers twitched with the longing for stimulus, and he had become more silent and abrupt than even his usual tendencies allowed. "I cannot help but observe, Holmes," said I, setting aside the day's paper, "that your discontent grows by the hour. Would a trip to the country not ease your agitation?" He turned slightly, his eyes distant, as though he had not heard me at all. "The country," he repeated at length, as though tasting the word. "No, Watson. I require action, not air." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson's measured tread ascended the stairs, followed by the soft rustle of an envelope being slipped beneath the door. Holmes did not move. I crossed to retrieve it, noting the heavy parchment and curious crest upon the wax seal. A black lion rampant, surmounted by a coronet, with a Latin motto I did not at once recognize. "A letter, Holmes," I said. "It appears rather heraldic." He turned then, and the moment his gaze fell upon the seal, I saw the blood drain from his face. Without a word, he took the envelope from my hand and moved to the fire, where he broke the seal with uncharacteristic care. I observed his eyes travel quickly across the page, his brows knitting more tightly with each line. He read the letter twice, thrice, then crumpled it in his hand with such force that the paper groaned. "Holmes," I ventured, "is something amiss?" He did not answer. He turned on his heel and strode toward his room. "I shall be occupied," he said, and his voice had dropped to that flat, toneless register I had come to associate with only the gravest of matters. "Do not disturb me until morning, Watson." The door shut behind him with a quiet finality. I remained by the fire, the warmth no longer quite reaching me. Whatever missive had arrived, it had wounded Holmes more surely than any villain's bullet. In all our time together, I had seen him moved by logic, curiosity, even wrath, but never had I seen him haunted. And so the fog thickened, outside our window and within the chambers of 221B. When I rose the following morning, I found Holmes already at the breakfast table, his features composed but pale, as though he had wrestled with some nocturnal demon and emerged barely the victor. He greeted me with a curt nod and said nothing as I took my seat across from him. "I trust you rested well?" I offered, hoping to gauge his temper. "Well enough," he said shortly. Then, as if to deflect the subject, he added, "You will be pleased to hear that I have decided upon a course of action." "Oh, yes," said he, stirring his tea absently. "We shall be occupied this day. There is a matter in Lambeth that requires my attention." Before I could press him for particulars, we were interrupted by a brisk knock at the door. Moments later, Inspector Lestrade was shown in, his lean face bearing the haggard excitement of a man pursuing prey. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, "I hope to find you at liberty. We've a situation that cries out for your particular talents." Holmes gave a slight incline of the head. "Pray, do sit, Lestrade. What is the matter?" The inspector dropped into the armchair opposite Holmes and produced a folded telegram from his coat. "Disappearance of a clerk from the Foreign Office. Young fellow named Ellery. Vanished without a trace 3 nights ago. His superior received a tip that the lad may have been approached by agents of a foreign power. It's all damned delicate, you understand. Holmes sipped his tea, entirely unmoved. And you require my assistance? Naturally. No one else has your insight into such matters. The Home Office is pressing us for results. If there's been a leak, we must plug it quickly. Holmes set down his cup with deliberate care. I regret to inform you, Lestrade, that I am otherwise engaged. The inspector blinked. Engaged? But I thought. I have already committed myself to a matter of some personal importance, Holmes said with quiet finality. You will forgive me if I decline to embroil myself in the political intrigues of Whitehall. But surely, Lestrade began. I believe Mr. Gregson is available, Holmes interrupted. You may find his methods less particular. Lestrade stood, red-faced and sputtering. Very well. I dare say I'll not beg. You may close the door behind you, Holmes said without looking up. After the inspector's departure, I turned to Holmes with some astonishment. You decline a case involving espionage to pursue. What, exactly? He rose and fetched his coat from the stand. A disappearance, he said. A man named Oswald Rivington, tutor at St. Ursula's Charity School in Lambeth. Gone 3 days. The police consider it unremarkable. And you consider it otherwise? I do. But why? I persisted. Holmes paused at the threshold, eyes fixed on the swirling fog beyond. Because, Watson, he said, voice low, this time the matter is not academic. Rivington once meant something to me. He strode from the room without another word, leaving me to hastily don my coat and follow. St. Ursula's Charity School stood upon a narrow, soot-darkened lane in Lambeth, hemmed in by crumbling tenements and the low rumble of the river beyond. The iron gates, though securely chained, bore a faded dignity, and the building's ancient stones whispered of generations past in quiet hardship. We were admitted by a matronly woman in a black wool shawl who peered at us through spectacles as thick as bottle glass. You'll be Mr. Holmes, then? She said, nodding. The headmistress is expecting you. This way. The halls were dim and chill, with threadbare runners on the floor and gas lamps that hissed faintly as we passed. Our guide led us to a narrow office where a spare, gray-haired woman with a schoolmistress's severity and a scholar's composure awaited us behind a desk stacked with ledgers. Miss Redgrave, Holmes said with a slight bow. Thank you for receiving us. You said you were inquiring into Mr. Rivington's disappearance, she replied. Frankly, I'm astonished anyone cares. The police dismissed the matter as a man shirking his duties. And you do not share their view? I do not, she said crisply. Mr. Rivington was conscientious and reliable. He took a special interest in the boys of the higher forms, those with mathematical or analytical promise. His absence was sudden, without notice or farewell. Holmes nodded gravely. Might we view his quarters? They've been left untouched. She produced a key from her desk drawer. And you'll find this of interest as well. It's a registry of faculty and staff, dating back some years. Holmes accepted the thick ledger and tucked it beneath his arm. We ascended a narrow staircase to the upper dormitory level, where a modest room overlooked the school's rear courtyard. Holmes entered first, eyes sweeping over the tidy interior with mechanical precision. He examined the single trunk, the sparse bookshelves, and the desk with its meager scattering of ink-stained pages. I, meanwhile, idly opened the registry and began thumbing through the brittle pages. I stopped upon a sepia photograph affixed beside the entry for Oswald Rivington, Mathematics, 1883–87. 3 young men, perhaps in their 20s, stood together in collegiate robes, their expressions caught between solemnity and camaraderie. Holmes, I murmured, have a look at this. He crossed the room swiftly, and the moment his eyes fell upon the image, his fingers tightened around the edge of the book. There, I pointed. That's Rivington in the center. But the figure on the left, is that not you? It is, he said softly. And the man on the right? Holmes hesitated. Victor Trevor, Jr., he said at last. I started. Your old friend? From university. The one you mentioned in connection with the Gloria Scott, Holmes finished tersely. Yes, that was the term we shared lodgings. But what brings the three of you together in this context? You never mentioned knowing Rivington. I did not recall the connection until now, Holmes replied, still staring at the photo. His voice dropped an octave. There was a fourth man, you know. Not pictured. Who? He closed the registry with a snap and turned away. No one of consequence, he said. Come, Watson, we have much to do. But I saw how his hand trembled as he returned the book to his satchel. Whatever memory this photograph had stirred, it was no mere academic curiosity. I knew then that the case we pursued was not born of logic, but of something far older and far more personal. We left the school just as the afternoon light surrendered to the early dim of a London October, the air thick with chimney smoke and the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestone. Holmes walked ahead in silence, the photograph and ledger pressed firmly beneath his arm, as if the weight of those brittle pages had grown with each step. At last, when we had turned onto Westminster Bridge Road and the gas lamps blinked into pale bloom, I ventured, You recognize the third figure in that photograph, Victor Trevor. But what of the fourth man you mentioned? Holmes said nothing for several paces, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Then, as we passed beneath the orange glow of a lamp post, he spoke low and measured. His name, he said, was Julius. Julius Vernet Holmes. I halted mid-step. Your brother. He nodded once. You know of Mycroft, but Julius was the youngest of us. He entered university at 16. Mathematics, like Rivington. But he was different, Watson. Different from either of us. In what way? He saw patterns not merely in numbers, but in life. A born observer. He could read a man's intentions from his bootlaces and tell you the habits of a household by the angle of a door hinge. Holmes's voice grew softer. He saw the world as a clockwork of truth, ever ticking, and believed it his duty to understand it. A natural detective, then? No, said Holmes, his tone suddenly hard. He was never meant to be a detective. He wished to reform, not punish, to understand the criminal rather than catch him. He lacked the detachment required. I regarded him carefully. You admired him. I envied him, Holmes said. In those early days, it was he who taught me the value of observation. I had the sharper mind, perhaps, but he possessed something I never could. What was that? A conscience. We had reached the edge of the embankment. The river spread before us like a great black artery pulsing through the city. Holmes leaned against the railing and stared down at its sluggish flow. There was a scandal, he said after a long pause. A matter of academic integrity. Julius was implicated, falsely I believe, but he refused to protest. Said it was better to preserve the name than expose the truth. He disappeared shortly after. You never found him? I searched. For years. Letters went unanswered. The trail vanished. Holmes's hands clenched at the iron rail. I did not speak of him because to do so was to admit I had failed. Not in a case, but in a duty. And now Rivington, his old classmate, vanishes under suspicious circumstances. I said slowly. Do you believe there's a connection? I do not yet know, Holmes replied. But I intend to find out. If there is a thread, however frayed, I shall follow it. He turned then, and for a brief instant, I saw not the cold master of logic known to the world, but a man burdened by memory and guilt, chasing not a criminal, but a ghost. Our inquiries the following day led us from the fog-drenched courtyards of Lambeth to a far less reputable quarter, Clapham Road, south of the river, where Mr. Oswald Rivington, it was said, had lately been residing in a narrow and disreputable boarding house known as Crowthorne Lodge. It was the sort of place where the wallpaper curled like shedding bark, and the staircases groaned as if resentful of the weight of human feet. The landlady, a blowsy woman with a faded dressing gown and the nervous manner of one who had long since grown used to trouble, received us in a sitting-room that smelled of damp wool and gin. Mr. Rivington, sir? Yes, I remember him. Kept to himself, mostly. Paid in advance, thank heaven. Did he mention any acquaintances? Any callers? Holmes asked, eyes flicking over the contents of the room. An ashtray with Turkish blend, a broken walking stick by the door, a long cold hearth. Not that I saw, but 3 nights ago he left in a frightful hurry. Coat half on, no bag, no word. I heard voices raised in the hall. Male voices. He never came back. Holmes exchanged a glance with me and said, "His room, please." She led us up a creaking staircase to the top floor, where Rivington's modest quarters overlooked the rear alley. The room bore little of interest. No notes, no letters, no signs of violence. But as Holmes passed his gaze over the desk, his keen eye caught a slip of paper partially burned in the grate. He retrieved it with his forceps and laid it upon the sill. The writing was sparse, jagged impressions in faded graphite. A string of numbers and letters, scrambled but deliberate. 13HR/D4/St. Mary's/not safe/VH still watching. Holmes's expression darkened. "Do you recognize it?" I asked. He did not answer at once. His eyes had narrowed to slits, scanning the fragment with hawk-like intensity. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a pocketbook, leafing quickly through its contents until he found a small page covered in a series of symbols and ciphers. "I've seen this hand before," he muttered. "The symbols, substitutions. Look here, D4, that's a quadrant on a chessboard cipher we developed at university. And this," he tapped a shaky line, "that is his writing." "Whose?" He met my gaze. "Julius's." I started. "But you said he vanished. Are you suggesting that he lived, Watson? That perhaps all these years—" He broke off, his jaw tight. "Or perhaps his name is being used. Either conclusion is troubling." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cracked pane. "What now?" I asked. Holmes rose slowly. "Now we go to St. Mary's. Tonight." "St. Mary's Hospital?" He shook his head. "No. St. Mary's Yard. Near the docks. The note suggests a rendezvous or a warning. Either way, someone is watching. And I mean to find out whom." As we descended the narrow stair, I noted that Holmes's face bore a grim resolve. There was something more than logic now guiding his course. Something buried deep, born not of deduction, but of memory, guilt, and perhaps hope. The sun had long since dipped beneath the soot-stained skyline when we reached St. Mary's Yard, a desolate triangle of cobblestone hemmed in by the slumping backs of shipping warehouses and the black hush of the Thames. The gas lamps were few and guttering, their feeble light devoured by the thick mist that clung to the stones like mildew. Rats scurried among refuse heaps, and every echo seemed to carry some spectral footstep not our own. Holmes moved like a wraith through the shadows, his long coat flaring behind him, the glint in his eye more fevered than focused. I had seen him in many states, exuberant, frigid, calculating, but this night, there was something different in his bearing. A man possessed, perhaps, by something he dared not name. We searched the yard and adjoining alleyways for more than an hour, found nothing but broken crates, damp rope, and the pungent reek of brine. No sign of Rivington, no sign of Julius. At last, Holmes halted beneath a shattered archway and stood motionless, staring into the gloom. "Holmes," I said quietly, "this place is empty." He did not move. "Whatever meeting Rivington intended here, it is past. We've found no trace." Still he did not speak. Then, with a suddenness that startled me, he turned and strode away, not back toward Baker Street, but deeper into the warren of backstreets. I hurried after him. "Holmes, where are you going?" He gave no answer. It was not until we had climbed a hillock overlooking the river, near Battersea Bridge, that he finally stopped, before a small and crooked gate. The iron had long since rusted, the path overgrown, and beyond it stood a modest stone monument, choked by ivy. I looked to him, uncomprehending. "This was not part of the cipher," I said. "No," he replied. "It is part of the truth." He stepped through the gate, brushing away branches with the sleeve of his coat. I followed, though a heavy dread had begun to settle in my chest. We stood before a gravestone, simple and undecorated, save for an inscription faintly etched in the damp stone. Julius Holmes, 1860 to 1880. Fallen not by guilt, but by silence. Holmes removed his hat and stood in the mist, head bowed. His breath plumed in the cold night air, but he made no sound. At length, I said softly, "You told me you searched for him." "I did," he replied, his voice low and rough. "But too late." He knelt then, knelt the great Sherlock Holmes, and placed his fingers upon the cold earth as if to summon some echo of the boy who once walked beside him. "He was 19, he whispered, accused of academic theft by men who envied his brilliance. I begged him to fight it, but he would not. Said the stain upon the family name would ruin Mycroft's political prospects. I remained silent. He vanished 2 days later. I traced him to the South Bank, but by then he had already taken the Thames. I breathed in sharply. They pulled his body ashore a week later, miles downstream. The inquest ruled it suicide. He rose slowly, brushing the damp from his knees. I told Mycroft he died of scandal, but that was a lie. He died of honor. And he faltered. I had always thought it my duty to carry his flame, that by exposing deception, by solving the world's cruelties, I might atone. And now you believe his name has been resurrected, I said quietly, by someone unworthy of it. Holmes gave a slow nod, his eyes fixed on the grave. If that is true, Watson, then I must bury him again, properly. We turned from the headstone and walked back into the fog, the silence between us heavier than the London air. The following morning dawned bleak and colorless, with a drizzle that wept from the eaves like the tears of a city in mourning. Holmes had not spoken a word during our cab ride back to Baker Street the previous night, nor did he take food or sleep upon our return. Instead, he sat by the window with the ledger from St. Ursula's and the half-burned note from Rivington laid before him like relics of a private chapel. I awoke to find him in the same position, the dim morning light carving deep hollows in his pale face. He had not removed his dressing gown, and a fresh scattering of papers now adorned the table. "You have not slept," I said. He glanced up, the faintest flicker of life returning to his eyes. "On the contrary, Watson," said he, "my mind has been most active. In the still hours of the morning, certain pieces of the pattern began to align. A thread, once frayed, has revealed itself." He gestured to the charred note. "You recall the line, 'VH still watching?' Indeed. At first I assumed it referred to Victor Trevor, but the syntax is inconsistent with that conclusion." He stood abruptly and crossed to his desk, retrieving a small wooden box bound in dark leather. "This," he said, opening it with a key, "is the last thing Julius ever gave me." Inside lay a single sheet of thick paper, covered in an elegant looping cipher, rows of letters and symbols, unbroken by punctuation. It might have passed for gibberish to any layman, but I recognized at once the same style as that found on the scorched fragment. "You told me once he created his own substitution schemes," I said. "He did. He considered traditional ciphers vulgar." Holmes tapped the note. "This one uses Latin stems and positional shifts keyed to a date, our mother's birthday to be precise. It took me until 4 o'clock this morning to remember the key." He spread out both documents and, with methodical precision, began aligning the symbols and decoding aloud. "South Wharf, Warehouse, Oriel Syndicate, 13 HR. He stopped. "The Oriel Syndicate?" I repeated. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A name I've not heard in years. It was whispered at university, allegedly a fellowship of scholars and financiers with extra-academic ambitions. In short, a recruiting arm for espionage. Clever young minds turned toward less savory work." "And you believe Julius was involved?" He turned to me slowly. "No, I believe he refused them, and was punished for it." A long silence followed. Then Holmes continued, "If this cipher is genuine, and I believe it is, then Rivington discovered that the Oriel Syndicate still exists. He may have been attempting to bring it to light. And the 13 HR? A warehouse designation," South Wharf, dockside. And we shall go there this evening. I frowned. Holmes, we must proceed with care. If what you suspect is true, then we are already being watched, he said grimly. Make no mistake, Watson. This is no longer a matter of curiosity. They are using my brother's name, his cipher, possibly even his memory, and I will not permit that to stand. He turned back to the window, hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the fog clung to the panes like ghostly fingers. For years, he murmured, I hunted for some sign of Julius in the world. Now the world sends a sign to me. It would be ungrateful not to answer. It was well past twilight when we reached the South Wharf, a forsaken stretch of riverfront hemmed in by soot-blackened warehouses and the damp chill of low tide. The fog rolled in thick bands across the quay, curling round crates and chains like some living thing. A gas lamp sputtered near the customs gate, but otherwise the dock lay silent, as if even the rats had retreated from what dwelled there. Holmes led the way, gliding between the shadows like a cat through alleyways. He wore no disguise, only a flat cap and long coat, but his movements were so deliberate, so devoid of hesitation, that it seemed the mist parted of its own accord to grant him passage. There, he whispered, pointing to a large, sagging structure at the end of the quay. A weather-worn sign hung loosely over the archway. H13, Oriel Shipping and Storage. I drew my revolver instinctively. Holmes gave me a brief nod and slipped a slim blade from his inner pocket. I expect 3 men, possibly 4, he murmured. Be cautious. If they know we are here, they may attempt escape or worse. We entered the warehouse through a side door warped by moisture. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and old rope. Broken lanterns and rusted pulley systems dangled from the rafters, and the floorboards creaked beneath our feet like ship's timbers at sea. Holmes gestured for silence, and we listened. Voices, low and muffled, beyond the crates. We crept forward, Holmes ahead, myself covering our rear, until we came upon a makeshift office fashioned from planks and tarpaulin at the far end of the warehouse. Through a narrow slit in the curtain, we saw 3 men hunched over a table strewn with papers, ledgers, and what appeared to be a list of names. One of them, a gaunt fellow with a military mustache, held up a paper and laughed. He signed it, the fool. That's all we need. Once the society hears we've got Cambridge's finest on board, the rest will follow. Another, shorter man with sharp eyes and an Italianate cast, replied, And if he tries to run again? The first man shrugged. Then he joins the others in the river. Holmes moved like lightning. He threw aside the curtain and stepped forward. Gentlemen, he said with icy calm, I believe you have something that does not belong to you. Pandemonium erupted. The Italian drew a pistol, but I had already taken aim. I fired once, and the shot struck his shoulder, sending him crashing into the crates with a cry of pain. The third man bolted for the rear exit, but Holmes intercepted him with a blow to the jaw that sent the fellow sprawling. Only the leader remained, still seated, still composed. Well, he said, rising. Mr. Holmes, I presume. You presume correctly, Holmes replied. Now tell me, where is Oswald Rivington? A smirk flickered across the man's face. Already on a steamer, bound for silence. Or did you think this little performance would frighten me? I think, Holmes said coldly, that your papers, your codebooks, and your use of the name Julius Verney Holmes will hang you, whether Rivington speaks or not. The man's face darkened. It was clever, Holmes continued, advancing, resurrecting a dead name from Cambridge, a prodigy, once shamed, presumed drowned. Who would question a ghost? Holmes seized the collar of the man's coat. But I knew the ghost, he growled, and you are not worthy to speak his name. At that moment, the police whistle rang out behind us. Lestrade, summoned earlier by Holmes's discreet telegram, arrived with 2 constables in tow, who quickly took the stunned criminals into custody. Well, Mr. Holmes, Lestrade said, peering around the wreckage. Seems I missed the party. Only just, Holmes replied, brushing dust from his coat. The guests were already preparing to flee. And Rivington? Holmes turned toward a stack of crates, and there, bound but conscious, was the missing tutor, blinking against the lantern light. "Alive and wiser," Holmes said, "though I dare say he'll choose his colleagues more carefully in future." By the time we returned to Baker Street, dawn was brushing the soot-streaked rooftops with a pallid hue. The fog had thinned, and London, resilient as ever, began to stir once more from its uneasy slumber. Holmes, though outwardly composed, bore upon his features the fine tremor of exhaustion that only I, his constant companion, could perceive. Lestrade had been more than satisfied with the outcome. The men arrested in the warehouse were identified as former students turned mercenaries, clever enough to orchestrate an international blackmail ring, but not clever enough to avoid Holmes's scrutiny. The documents recovered would, no doubt, implicate other parties within the so-called Oriel Syndicate. Holmes, however, seemed to derive no satisfaction from the victory. He stood by the hearth, warming his long fingers before the fire, while I poured 2 cups of strong tea. "You have your man," I said, offering him one. "Rivington is safe. The syndicate dismantled." Even Lestrade offered genuine praise, though he choked on the words. Holmes accepted the cup absently. "Yes, Watson. All quite tidy." I knew that tone too well, bitterness veiled behind indifference. "Yet something troubles you." He turned. His gray eyes lit not with triumph, but a quiet fury. "They attempted to lay it all upon Julius," he said. "The papers, those forged statements, the ledger entries, they painted him as the architect of their scheme. A brilliant, fallen mind. It would have been the perfect mask. Anonymous, unchallengeable, already buried. But the cipher you deciphered, the one Rivington found, clearly shows Julius warning others. He opposed them." Holmes nodded. "And yet, had I not intervened, the world would never have known. The official report would speak of a disgraced student whose methods inspired treachery." He strode to his desk and withdrew a slim file, the label written in his precise hand, J.V. Holmes. From within, he removed a faded envelope, the letter from St. Ursula's that had arrived days earlier. "I could not show you this before," he said. "It was from the headmistress. She believed Rivington had come into possession of a private letter, penned years ago but never delivered. It was addressed to me." He handed it to me. The ink was faded, the handwriting elegant and steady. "My dear Sherlock, if I vanish from this world, it shall not be because I was guilty. I chose silence to protect those I loved. But should someone ever revive my name in darkness, I know you will not let it go unanswered. You always saw the truth where others sought scandal. You are stronger than I ever was. Do not forget that. Your brother, Julius." I looked up to see Holmes's gaze fixed not on the letter, but on the fire, where he now placed one of the syndicate's forged documents. The flames curled around it eagerly, devouring the lie. "I've submitted the cipher evidence to the proper authorities," he said. "Julius's name will be cleared. Quietly, perhaps, but thoroughly." There was a long silence between us. Then I said, "And now?" He gave a small, sardonic smile. "Now we await the next puzzle, Watson. There's always another." But I saw that his posture had changed, less taut, less guarded. The ghost he had carried for years had not vanished, but he had laid it down, if only for a time. That morning, he did not retreat into his room, nor reach for his chemical instruments. Instead, he stood with me at the window, watching the city awaken beneath the uncertain sun. It was not in Holmes's nature to dwell upon emotional matters. Yet, on the morning following our confrontation at the docks, he displayed a rare inclination for reflection, one which, as his friend and biographer, I would have been remiss not to mark with quiet astonishment. He stood at the window of our sitting room, arms loosely crossed, the morning newspaper unread at his side. The fire crackled in the grate, unheated, as if aware its warmth could do little to dispel the deeper chill Holmes carried. "Watson," he said after a long pause, "have I ever spoken to you of Julius's violin?" I set down my cup. "Only once many years ago. You said he played with greater feeling than precision." "Quite so. He could not match my technical range, nor my discipline. but there was a quality in his bowing, a melancholy sweetness, that made people listen even when he played imperfectly. He turned from the window, his features softened by memory. We were close once, inseparable even. He was 2 years my senior, but never looked down upon me. If anything, he lifted me, constantly challenging, constantly questioning. You admired him, with the fervor of a boy who knows he will never outshine his brother in the eyes of the world. This confession, spoken without bitterness, surprised me more than any discovery made in a locked room or alleyway. He was brilliant, Holmes continued, pacing slowly, but he trusted too easily. He believed knowledge elevated all men, that cleverness would protect him. But cleverness alone is not a shield. He stopped before the mantel and took up his pipe. Then, curiously, set it down again untended. When the news came, his disappearance, the disgrace, I was still at university. I returned to my rooms and broke every beaker on my shelves. My tutor thought it a fit of eccentricity. In truth, I was simply lost. I said nothing. There was no need. That, he said, meeting my gaze, was when the idea formed, not consciously at first, but steadily, like water finding its channel. What idea? I asked gently. He drew a breath. To master the art of detection. To be so precise, so irrefutable in my deductions, that no man could be falsely judged again, not without resistance. If I could expose truth where others were blind, then perhaps I could rewrite a world that had so carelessly rewritten Julius. He smiled faintly. You once called my work a crusade. I did not correct you. And now? I asked. Now that you have redeemed his name? Holmes looked toward the fire. I do not believe in closure, Watson. That is a myth invented by sentimentalists. But clarity is another matter. After a moment, he turned briskly toward the table and, in true Holmesian fashion, reached for the morning's correspondence. 3 new cases: a theft in Belgravia, a vanishing hound in Surrey, and a scandal involving an Austrian diplomat and a misplaced sapphire. Which will it be? I asked. He paused. None today. I believe we shall go for a walk instead. Regent's Park, perhaps. A walk? I echoed in mild disbelief. No disguises? No stakeouts? No, he said. No masks today. And so we stepped into the gray London morning, not as detective and chronicler, but as 2 men briefly unburdened by the past. It was a quiet day, perhaps the quietest I had ever known in Holmes's company. We spent the morning in Regent's Park, strolling along gravel paths dusted with dew. The air had a peculiar clarity to it, and though Holmes spoke little, there was a lightness in his bearing that I had not seen in many years, an invisible weight, long borne, seemingly lessened at last. We stopped beneath an ancient elm, where Holmes took a bench and gazed out at the pond. A trio of ducks glided through the water, their wake leaving a wavering line upon the mirrored surface. I never told my parents the full truth, he said suddenly, his voice low but steady. I turned to him, surprised by the abruptness of his remark. About Julius? He nodded. Our father died believing Julius had perished in disgrace, and our mother never spoke of him again. I often wonder if that silence was her form of grief, or her form of doubt. You were young, I said gently. You could not have known the whole of it then. Perhaps, he replied, but I suspect I knew enough. Enough to know that silence did more damage than accusation ever could. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folded sheet of paper, the edges crisp and freshly torn. With great care he handed it to me. I unfolded it to find a new letter, his own hand, written in that immaculate, angular script so familiar to my eye. Julius, your name has been cleared, the stains upon your honor wiped clean, though not publicly, and not with the same fanfare as your fall. That is the way of truth, it works in silence. You gave me the first mystery I ever tried to solve. You also gave me the burden I have spent a lifetime carrying. The knowledge that intelligence is not always armor enough. But I have learned, and I have fought, and I have not let the darkness win easily. Wherever you rest, know that your voice did not go unheard. Your brother, Sherlock. I don't know if I believe in symbolic gestures, Watson, Holmes said as I refolded the letter. But there is a postbox by the north gate. It is a private one, no longer in use, sealed long ago when the estate changed hands. Julius and I used to post letters there when we were boys. Secrets, mostly. Dreams. Wild theories. He stood and stretched his long frame. I intend to post one more. And so he did. With no audience, no ceremony, and no certainty of result, Holmes walked to the forgotten gate, slid the letter through the rusted slot, and walked away without looking back. I do not pretend to understand the full nature of that act, but I know that for Holmes, it marked something more than mere nostalgia. It was a closing of a loop long left open. Not resolution, perhaps, but release. As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes turned to me and said with a curious softness, "Thank you, Watson. You've chronicled 1,000 cases, but I suspect this one will never be told." I gave him a small smile. "No one need read it, Holmes, but it deserves to be written." He nodded once, then resumed his customary brisk pace, already 5 paces ahead of me by the time I caught up. It was some days after our walk in Regent's Park that I observed in Holmes a subtle but unmistakable shift. There was a calmness about him, not the languid torpor that occasionally settled upon him between cases, but a composed stillness, like that of a violin finely tuned to its proper key. He resumed his routines, to be sure. His morning correspondence, his monographs on tobacco ash and Persian poisons, and the endless stream of curious clients that passed through our sitting room. But now, there was less of the restless hunger behind his eyes. The need to prove, to outpace some unseen rival had, it seemed to me, abated. One quiet evening as we sat by the fire, he cleaning his pipe and I attending to my notes, he spoke again of Julius. "I have often thought, Watson, that what we become is not solely the consequence of our gifts, but of the griefs we carry." "A philosopher now, Holmes?" I said with a smile. He smirked faintly. "Hardly. Merely an observer. The world believes me to be cold, dispassionate, perhaps even cruel in my rationality. But you've seen more." "I have," I replied, "and I've always known there was more beneath the surface than you allowed the world to see." He leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded. "My brother's fate shaped me far more than I ever admitted, even to myself. He was my first study in injustice. The lesson was brutal but enduring. You sought justice in his name. I sought truth," he corrected. "But yes, Julius was my beginning. And in some strange sense, he is also my resolution." He lapsed into silence after that, and I did not press him. The coals in the hearth glowed low, casting soft shadows on the walls of 221B. The familiar scent of Holmes's pipe tobacco drifted through the room, mingling with the distant sounds of carriages and boots upon the cobbled street below. In that moment, I realized that Holmes, for all his intellect and composure, had always been driven by something deeply human. A brother's wounded pride, a need to restore what the world had wrongly destroyed, and a desire to stand in the gap where others had failed. It was not merely the puzzle that called him, nor the thrill of the chase. It was redemption, not only for Julius but perhaps in part for himself. I have recorded many adventures of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, some remarkable for their ingenuity, others for their danger or drama. But none have revealed more about the man behind the legend than this quiet chapter. One never shared in public papers, nor published in Strand magazine. And yet, I believe it to be his greatest triumph. Not in logic, but in loyalty. Not in deduction, but in devotion. And so I close this account not with a flourish, but with a quiet nod to the truth Holmes cherished above all else. That beneath the cold mask of reason beat a heart wounded, human, and ultimately heroic. Dr. John H. Watson, 221B Baker Street, London, April 1894. Sometimes, the greatest mystery lies not in a crime, but in the heart of the man who seeks to solve it. If this story gave you a new glimpse into the world of Sherlock Holmes, don't forget to like, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more original literary tales told in the voice of the classics. Until next time, keep your mind sharp and your heart open.